Today's day 23. I'm reading Reader Come Home by Marion Wolf. Page 96. A case study of the digital chain hypothesis. And so I come to the story of my unsettling. Hardly the grist of a bestseller. The plotline is this: researcher of reading and its changes. Um, Its changes in a digital culture awakens one day and is forced to confront whether she has changed it too. It remains for me a pitiful tale with a few detailed lessons for both of us and worse to eat for me. Calvino once wrote that Washington Irving's R.I.P. Van Winkle has acquired the status of a foundation myth for your ever changing society. It is certainly the case for me, and twice now. As I described in my first letter, my initial awakening experience happened at the end of writing Proust and the Squid. After 7 years of researching the reading brain, I looked around and realized that my entire subject matter had changed. Reading was no longer the entity it was when I had begun. The second experience hit still closer to home. Despite all my research on the changing reading brain, I never realized that the same things were true for me until the effects were close to the proverbial done deal. They began innocently enough, like everyone else, with increasing responsibilities in my professional and personal lives, and an ever increasing load of what I had to read and write in any given day on any number of digital mediums. I began to make little compromises. I still tried to use email more like a note in an envelope, a social greeting with its own forms of politeness. But every note was becoming shorter and terser. There was no waiting for the perfect moment to write tranquil thoughts, an admittedly elusive goal of my former style. I just did my best at any given moment and hoped for cosmic forgiveness for failing to meet the projected expectations of the recipients of all my communications. As for reading, I increasingly depended on Google Scholar, daily weekly summaries in journals and such as Science, online news, online New Yorker stories, and so on for what I thought I need to know or needed to read later in more depth. Various subscriptions to newspapers and magazines came and went. I could no longer keep up with the ones that mattered most, the ones that provided most in-depth commentaries of public life, and so I didn't. I pretended to myself and I would catch up on the weekends, but the unmet deadlines of the week bled into the weekends, whose earlier restorative goals gradually disappeared. The next vanishing act was the heretofore highly anticipated books that always sat at my besides waiting to be read. Um, in their place, in the final minutes of my day, came the last email, so that I could sleep feeling virtuous instead of comforting by a reflection of Marcus Aurelius, or thrilled by reading the books of Kent Haruf or Wendell Berry, in which little happened save for the recollected insights of the people who are guided by the earth rhythms, human love, and test the virtue, and whose observations quiet the unquiet mind and restless heart. I still bought many books. I still bought many books, but more and more I read in them rather than being whisked away by them. At some time impossible to pinpoint, I had begun to read more to be informed than to be immersed, much less to be transported. With that unwelcome realization, I stopped in my own version of suspended disbelief. Was it possible that I had become the reader for whom I was losing my weekends writing about, and indeed for? Hubris alone pretended by acceptance of such a scenario. Rather, like any scientist confronting a researchable question, I set up an experiment. Unlike every other study I conducted, I was the single subject in a single cell design. My null hypothesis, if you will, was that I have not changed my reading style. Rather, only the time I had available for reading had changed. I could prove that simply enough by controlling for it by setting aside the same amount of time every day and faithfully observing my own reading of a linguistically different, conceptually demanding novel, one that had been one of my favorite books when I was younger. I would know the plot. There would be no suspense or mystery involved. I would have only to analyze what I was doing during my reading in the same way that I might analyze what a person with dyslexia does when he or she is reading in my research center. Okay, I should stop here. Again, this is Minky. Please correct me if you can. Thank you.